Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Today, we begin a new endeavor, which is the reading of this book. For those who have already attended one of our lectures, or even those who have never been but have visited our YouTube channel, you'll see that on YouTube we have over 100 free lectures. And among them, some are part of the reading circle I've been conducting. The idea was to take the most beautiful books I've read in my life and share them with you chapter by chapter, broken down and digested. Sometimes they are very beautiful, but not so easy to understand, and when we read together, even I benefit from it. So we have, for example, the complete sequence of The Prophet by Khalil Gibran on YouTube, 26 lectures. We'll have a complete series of Seeking Wisdom by Sri Ram, 15 lectures. And the intention for this book is also to have 15 talks, one for each chapter. It's a small book, but it contains 15 chapters. And it's one of those books I recommend you keep on your nightstand. For anyone with an interest in a certain level of Eastern philosophy, for those who are interested in one day reading Helena Blavatsky, which is truly worthwhile, the Kybalion is a wonderful introduction. It greatly helps in understanding Eastern works that are sometimes a bit more complex, as well as Western works like those of a writer such as Helena Blavatsky so well. You are all very welcome to the beginning of this journey. It's not such a simple book. If you check on YouTube, I've already given a lecture on this book, a 1-hour lecture covering the entire book. It has 126 pages. Naturally, I had to extract a few things. I had to skip around a bit, make a selection, which is necessary for a time frame like that, but it's the kind of book that leaves you with a bit of a heartache that I wish I had been able to talk about. In 1 hour it's impossible, but in 15 hours we can do it. So we'll go through it chapter by chapter, carefully. I hope it will be an enjoyable experience for you. I've really loved doing these reading groups. I intend to keep them going, and I'm open to suggestions for new titles in the future. Well, we'll talk a bit more about this book in just a moment. Within it, there is a piece of poetry, a poem in which he says, as the poet says. But he doesn't mention who the poet is. And if you search for it on Google, you won't find it anywhere. I have no idea where he got it from. I really like this short verse, this 5-stanza poem that he includes, because it's almost like a summary of the book's central idea. Very beautiful and very thought-provoking. It's a poem that says the following. Oh, do not let the flame be extinguished, kept from century to century in this dark cave, in this sacred temple sustained by pure ministers of love. Do not let this divine flame be extinguished. Basically, tradition or transmission is the etymology of the word Kybalion. And you'll agree that the central word of this poem is just that. Tradition, transmission, passing the flame forward. Imagine if you have the opportunity to watch some of these lectures that we have on YouTube. I believe that in most of them, at some point, we mention Plato, who is such an important philosopher that he's like a watershed in human thought. Just imagine that for Plato to reach our times. He had to pass through 1,000 years of a dark and complex Middle Ages. Someone kept the flame alive during that time so that he could reach us. You might say, well, but the patristics and scholastics, Christianity adopted Plato. Yes, they adopted Plato in a Christian way, adapting his worldview. Plato, in the way of Plato himself, virtually disappeared and only re-emerged during the Renaissance. But someone, during those 1,000 years, must have preserved those books, those works. You know that, for example, Aristotle's Poetics was passed down to us through a single surviving copy, which ended up in the hands of a Byzantine scholar. Did you know that? Just one copy. A great deal was lost. The works, for example, of Chrysippus of Soli, who was a prominent Stoic writer. It is said that he wrote nearly 500 short treatises. Have you ever heard of any work by Chrysippus of Soli, or even his name? Not a single one remains. Not one. A great deal was lost. But some things reached us because someone kept the flame alive through the darkness of time, and because of that we gained an extraordinary advantage. If anyone knows anything about Plato's philosophy, can you imagine if we had lost Plato? Would have to wait for someone of his caliber to return and say something. so we could even begin, because not anyone can reach those kinds of conclusions. It's a gift to humanity that Plato's work has reached us in the way it has, which is truly something extraordinary. In fact, one of my future projects is to give a lecture on each of Plato's books. It's absolutely worth it. Who knows? Maybe a reading circle each lecture focused on one of Plato's works. We gain so much from these writings. So imagine that there was an anonymous group of individuals who kept this knowledge alive. We know about Plato, but who preserved Plato's work? Throughout the Middle Ages, a time when reading philosophy hardly anyone could read during the Middle Ages. You know that even kings, those few that existed. Charlemagne, for example, was illiterate. He couldn't even sign his own name. Illiteracy was widespread during the Middle Ages. So who kept this knowledge alive? Who protected it? Who gave value to this? You know, much of it was preserved in the Arab world and by a few isolated individuals within Europe. We owe it to these individuals. What this poem tells us is, be one of those individuals. Keep the flame alive. Sustain the flame of true, profound human knowledge. Because true and profound knowledge is understood as that which, when placed in your life, can help you become a better human being. Understand this, there is a very simple maxim. That was spoken by a teacher named Jorge Angel Livraga, who is the founder of New Acropolis, in which he says the following: if you take a chariot from ancient Rome, a chariot, the kind pulled by horses, and compare it to a modern jet plane, there's no doubt that the vehicle has advanced tremendously. But the person operating the vehicle has not necessarily advanced. That airplane pilot today is not necessarily more fraternal than the man from back then, or perhaps more understanding, or perhaps with greater control over his emotions, with self-knowledge, with mastery over his own selfishness. Perhaps not. In other words, the machine has evolved, but the human operating the machine not necessarily. And if you take a look from the philosophical point of view expressed by Plato and by the great masters of philosophy, knowledge is only useful when it makes us better. Because the machines that equip human action in the world will fulfill what the human being aims in the world. And if he is deeply selfish, then technology sometimes only amplifies that selfishness. If you're heading toward the abyss, it's better to go on foot. Because if you go in an imported car, you'll get there faster. If the destination is the abyss, it's better to go slowly. So speed, agility, and efficiency, when you're not quite sure where you want to go as a human being, are of questionable value for the progress of humanity. In fact, this has everything to do with our talk today, because Hermes Trismegistus spoke this: the care that must be taken with information, while a person still lacks formation. When someone is not yet well formed, not deep, be careful not to expand knowledge in someone who lacks depth. Because if a person has bad character, a sickly character, information will only amplify that sickly character. Wouldn't it have been better if Adolf Hitler had been completely inept? His abilities only amplified his psychopathy. Adolf Hitler would have been better off if he were incompetent. Do you see? So the enhancement of a person's abilities without first becoming humanized was a major concern for Hermes Trismegistus, the foundation of the Kybalion, of the great mythical writer of the Kybalion, of the Hermetic laws. Be careful. So this is, let's say, the essence of this poem. Pass on essential knowledge, so that humanity may continue to grow as human beings. This is the book, the one right here. It's a book, folks, that was written in 1908. We'll talk about that in a moment. But how so? Isn't it by Hermes Trismegistus the Egyptian? Yes, the maxims. They took the 7 maxims, 7 laws. Understand this while Hermes Trismegistus, we'll talk about him shortly. An ancient Egyptian sage. He said, he'll share with you 7 laws. That explained the entire manifested universe, the whole manifested universe on all planes, from the subtle to the concrete. They are 7 tiny little phrases. These are found within the Corpus Hermeticum and also in the Emerald Tablet. But when you look at it, well, what exactly was he trying to say with that? This book takes those 7 maxims and comments on them one by one, and it does so with great authority. However, this book, published in 1908, was released anonymously. The author signed it as 3 initiates. To this day, no one really knows who these three initiates are. Someone who possessed a certain depth of knowledge took the 7 laws of Hermes Trismegistus and offered commentary on them, and gave it the following title: A Study of the Hermetic Philosophy of Ancient Egypt and Greece. Whoever it was someone who knew what they were talking about. Because the book is of indisputable quality, it speaks of this knowledge that was born in Egypt, which later passed on to Greece, then to Rome, and became a heritage of humanity Hermeticism. Well, there are suspicions. There are suspicions among scholars and commentators who have studied this book throughout history. They say the main suspect is this individual, William Walker Atkinson. Who is William Walker Atkinson? No one knows. He was a somewhat mysterious figure. He belonged to an order called New Thought, and he mostly wrote under pseudonyms. Imagine a person who wrote around 100 works over the course of his life, and another 10 under his own name. He didn't like his own name. I don't know why. It's a nice name, but he didn't like it, because he didn't use it. He has more pseudonyms than Fernando Pessoa. He didn't use his own name. One of the names he often used was Yogi Ramakaraka. Have you ever heard that name? Sometimes people think he was Hindu. He wasn't. He was this man, an American. He used countless names. Because the publishing house that released the first edition of this book operated in the same building as the order to which he belonged, so people suspected it was him. Honestly, I have my doubts. I don't know if any of you have the habit of writing amateurishly. Those who enjoy writing tend to have a certain trait. They become sensitive to the style of other writers. I show you a text and say, Machado de Assis. You look at it and say, it doesn't seem like it. It doesn't have the same feel. I've been reading some books by this William Walker Atkinson. And you know what? They have nothing to do with the Kybalion. In fact, his work is of very mixed quality. He even writes about how to make money. A very heterogeneous body of work and very little resemblance to the Kybalion. So, it's just a suspicion. There's no concrete evidence of it. There's another strong suspicion, which points to Mabel Collins, who was a direct disciple of Helena Blavatsky from Theosophy. But again, there's no proof. Mabel Collins, I actually take into consideration, because she has another remarkable work, The Light on the Path, and she has style, she writes well, but that's not certain either. The fact is, whoever wrote it did not want their name to go down in history, and they left a magnificent commentary on the 7 Hermetic laws of ancient Egypt. Here we have a first French edition. The book was first published in 1908, and today it's a global success, published worldwide. So, what is this book about? About this figure, Hermes Trismegistus. Hermes Trismegistus was a man who lived in Egypt during a highly debated period, who was so wise that his name later received this epithet, Trismegistus, the thrice initiated. I'll explain to you shortly what initiation means. For the Egyptians, an extremely wise man was considered an initiate, initiated once. Hermes Trismegistus was inducted 3 times. He was a great master. It is said that people from all over the world came to learn from him. He welcomed disciples from across the globe. If you go online today, you'll come across at least 3 or 4 different dates that are believed to be the time he lived, and you'll even find some who claim he never lived at all. That he is a mythical figure. Don't be surprised. If you look into Laozi, the same is said about him. Some say the same about Confucius, about Buddha. The existence of great historical figures is often surrounded by controversy. There is little concrete historical evidence. So there's a lot of speculation, and even some who don't believe they ever existed. Personally, I don't subscribe to that theory. I believe that someone who creates a work that endures for at least 4,000 years of history have been a person of great significance. And when you see a footprint of that magnitude, it must have been a giant who walked through here. An arbitrary collection of compilations and opinions would not have generated such historical impact. I believe for something to last, it must have been real. It is the shadow of who this man was. At least 4,000 years of history is the shadow of who this man was. It wasn't just anyone who did this. I do believe he may have had disciples who supported him, who carried that knowledge forward, but that there was someone truly special behind it, I have no doubt. Now notice that the dates, the book itself, the Kybalion, mentions 2,700 years before Christ. But that's a date it somewhat contradicts itself on. It says that Hermes Trismegistus would have lived during the dynasty, the Hyksos invasion. They were a people of Semitic origin invaded Egypt. Well, the first Hyksos dynasty dates back to 1990 before Christ. It doesn't match the date it gives itself. And then it says he was Abraham's teacher. According to Genesis, Abraham would have lived in 1944 BC. But during the Renaissance, it was said that he was Moses' teacher. Moses lived in 1512, that is, anywhere between 300 and 1500 years before Christ. You can place him because no one is really certain about anything. There is no precise date for when Hermes Trismegistus lived. Here I brought for you just as a point of curiosity that image, because it is a painting, a fresco, from an Italian cathedral called the Cathedral of Siena, which depicts nothing more and nothing less than Hermes Trismegistus teaching Moses. Moses being portrayed as a disciple of Hermes Trismegistus. This is something almost unthinkable if you consider that there was an inquisition at the time and that people were sent to the stake for far less. The beginning of the Renaissance saw a great deal of freedom of expression, and it was supported by the Church. Later, when the Counter-Reformation began, the Church clamped down and clipped the wings of the Renaissance. But in the early days of the Renaissance, there was much boldness, and the Church endorsed it, supported it. Can you imagine painting Hermes Trismegistus inside a Christian cathedral and teaching Moses? Another cathedral, the Italian one, has Hypatia of Alexandria inside, surrounded by Christians, and she is teaching. In other words, the first Renaissance philosophers, especially in Florence, from the Platonic school of Correggi led by Marsilio Ficino. These individuals were very courageous and bold. In fact, we'll talk about this. They translated the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin. For the first time in history, they were truly daring. And the Church, up to a certain point, accepted this quite well. It's fascinating to see a painting of Hermes Trismegistus inside a Christian cathedral teaching Moses. This exists, and it still exists to this day. So the date when he lived is highly debated. It's difficult for us to determine. He was a master who influenced everyone known in his time. And the book itself affirms this. His influence even reached as far as India. It extended to Greece and Rome. Through India, it also reached other peoples of Indo-European linguistic origin, such as the Celts and the Scandinavians, to all corners of the ancient religions, and the book dares to go a bit further. It even speaks of modern, traditional religions. If you look closely, you will find traces of Egyptian wisdom behind them. You will find traces of the Kybalion, the worldview that the Kybalion presented. If you take a wise figure such as, for example, Clement of Alexandria, who was part of the Church, he said Hermes Trismegistus was the inventor of theology, the creator of theology. There were men of the Church. Saint Albert the Great. Read the Corpus Hermeticum in Coptic Greek. There was no Latin version, and he appreciated it. He was a saint of the Church. He had a significant impact throughout history. And it is said that even in our own time, if you look closely and study the religious corpus of the Semitic monotheisms and of some Eastern religions, you will find the influence of Hermeticism. It spread widely, both in space and in time. These works, which are what remain of Hermes Trismegistus today, are fragments of what once existed. Some ancient writers even said that he had written more than 45 treatises on medicine. Medicine was one of the areas that Hermetic knowledge covered extensively. It dealt a great deal with medicine. Hermes Trismegistus' view of health was well known in the ancient world. All of that has been lost. What we have today from Hermes Trismegistus are basically these remaining works. We have, in quotation marks for example, the Minerva Mundi, which doesn't exist in Portuguese. But if you search in English or Spanish on the internet, you can find it. It is also known as Kore Cosmo, the Virgin of the World, which speaks of the myth of the Virgin. It says that the Virgin is virgin matter that was fertilized by the Spirit. It is the volatile, the matter, that is fertilized by the fixed, the Spirit. It later became the foundation for medieval alchemy to use, the combination of the fixed and the volatile, of the spirit and matter. It's a short treatise, and in fact, I find it quite beautiful. Minerva Mundi, the emerald tablet, it's a tiny little thing. It was a tablet, on which were written, it was a piece of stone, on which a few laws were inscribed in a very enigmatic way, but very similar to the maxims found in the Kybalion. And finally, a somewhat larger work called the Corpus Hermeticum. The corpus, meaning the collection of discourses, attributed to Hermes Trismegistus that have come down to us. It is mainly divided between the Asclepius. I don't know if you've ever heard of Asclepius or Aesculapius, the god of medicine. In this dialogue, Hermes teaches Asclepius the secrets of medicine. Above all, the pinnacle of the secret of medicine, which is the fact that things come from the spiritual plane to the physical plane. Both health and illness are not born here. They are only reflected here. They come from the spirit, pass through the soul, and impact the body. The body is the organ of impact, and if you only heal the body, you block a certain point, and the illness will manifest elsewhere. He speaks about the subtle origin of human balance or imbalance. He teaches this to Asclepius. It is a discourse from Hermes to Asclepius, and the other is the Poimander or Poimandres, where he speaks with himself, where he engages in what is almost an inner dialogue about the nature of humanity. What I find interesting is that in the Poimandres, he divides all of nature into 7 parts. For him, 7 is a sacred number. Well, see that several original fragments of this work were found among the Coptic manuscripts of Nag Hammadi from around 300 something AD. Several fragments were studied by the Gnostics, the early Christians. Discussed soon. The first Christians, the Basilidians. The Ophite sect, the sect of Basilides, and the various Gnostic sects that existed at the beginning of the Christian era studied Hermes Trismegistus. And when some of these manuscripts were discovered, several original fragments of the Corpus Hermeticum were found. I find that quite fascinating, to come across an original piece of an Egyptian work. Truly fascinating, especially since it was unknown. One of the most symbolic. The Imagesto, you see the staff in his hand with 2 intertwined serpents? That is what's called the caduceus of Mercury. This is directly associated with Hermetic knowledge, because it was the way he expressed the interwoven worlds, from the most subtle to the most concrete. Now, it's likely that this was a symbol that existed before him, because you find it in many scriptures and archaeological remnants of very ancient civilizations. For example, King Dudia of Lagash had a cup. This King Dudia was Sumerian, and this cup is dated by archaeologists today to 2600 BC. You can see it's clad with the caduceus of Mercury, the 2 intertwined serpents. There is a tale that dates back to the Greco-Roman era, which says that the god Mercury was passing through a place and saw 2 serpents fighting each other. He takes his staff and places it between them, the 2 serpents that were fighting each other become harmonized and ascend along the staff. They become upright. This is interesting because it became deeply associated within the symbolic alphabet. The serpent crawling on the ground represents human energies that are directed toward the earth, toward instinct, toward selfishness. Serpents ascending somewhere represent these energies when they become verticalized, to elevate human consciousness upward. Be cautious in dreams. We often tend to oversimplify, relying on dream interpretation booklets from newsstands. Dreaming of a snake, wisdom. Not always it depends on what the snake is doing in your dream. A crawling snake is more closely associated with instinct, planning something, climbing a tree. I won't go into that topic, because we need to talk about the Gnostic Gospels. But a serpent climbing a tree, a serpent climbing a staff, represents this consciousness becoming verticalized. So, this symbol, which is directly associated with Hermes Trismegistus, and is the symbol of accounting, is also used in medicine and by many today. There, it was the Roman Mercury holding this staff. It became known as the caduceus of Mercury. This, my friends, is the symbol of the human being. Imagine that the lowest sphere represents the physical body. The middle one, the psychic body, mind, and emotions. And at the top, the spiritual body. The human being would be composed of these 3 worlds. He has a physical body, whose main drive is to survive and reproduce. The two instincts. He has a spiritual body whose essence is to attain values, virtues, and wisdom. And he has a psychic body in between, which has no clear direction and jumps around like a madman. Because we haven't learned to educate our emotions and our mind. So, the circuit of the three worlds doesn't close. Because we lack control over our own psyche. Do you notice that? When we're little, what are we taught? To crawl, to sit, to walk, to hold a pencil, to use utensils. So that's the physical body. No one teaches you to master your emotions or your mind. It's as if that were arbitrary and impossible to control. And we suffer our whole lives because our emotions remain like that. Our thoughts are scattered, unable to focus on anything. We struggle our lives. They say humans can master these things, but they must. They should learn to master these tools in order to allow a greater expression of their higher self in the material world. To complete the bridge. It is said that when a person brings balance to their psyche, the spiritual flows through it and manifests in the world. They become an instrument in the hands of a divine being, your own inner God. Your essence. When you bring balance to the three worlds, you pass the staff through the center, and the law is established. It descends from heavens to earth. You create a bridge between heaven and earth. Like the staff that Mercury put between the serpents. You'll see that if we were to talk about this. There is so much we could say about it. Western mythology is deeply marked by this symbol. If you look at the myth of King Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot represent exactly that. They are the three worlds. Guinevere was the human soul, which includes our thoughts and emotions. She falls in love with the body and betrays the spirit. That is the betrayal of Guinevere toward Arthur. If you look at the major rupture that occurred between Jung and Freud, it has to do with this. Because Freud acknowledged the existence of the psychic world, but he believed that psychic content originates from the physical, that is, eros and thanatos, the instincts which arise and generate psychic content. Jung, on the other hand, said there is something higher up that influences this psychic world. This was unacceptable to Freud, to Freud's way of thinking. Jung was a man slightly ahead of his time, far ahead of his time. He was deeply inspired, in fact, by Hermeticism through medieval alchemy, which he was very fond of. Well, see that medieval alchemy was Hermetic. It was pure Hermeticism. If you take a look at Jung's The Red Book, you'll see it filled with alchemical drawings. He used them as a way to understand the things he wanted to express. He expressed himself through ancient symbols. So this symbol shows that the intention of Hermes Trismegistus was to communicate with the inner self, the human being, to help the human being express what lies deepest within them, the highest within. He was considered such a wise being in Egypt that the Egyptians, upon his death, deified him. They transformed him into a god, the ibis, Thoth. Later, the Greeks came and turned him into one of their own gods, the god Hermes. You can see his image here. You can see him in the corner with the little hat. Hermes is the one who wears a helmet with little wings and has wings on his heels. Remember him? That was the Greek version of Thoth, and later he became Mercury in Rome. But always with the same idea. Messenger of the gods, scribe of the gods, communicator between heaven and earth. Is anyone here a Gemini? A Gemini over there. There are lots of Geminis here. Geminis are communicators, you know that. That's the main trait of the sign. Ruled by Hermes Mercury. It's a sign ruled by Hermes Mercury. Now take a look, a small detail about these two representations, which are representations of their time. Notice that the Egyptians, they considered the ibis to be a good symbol of wisdom because of its slender beak. Surrounded by a swarm of insects, it picks out the one it wants. It has discernment, the ability to choose among many. The etymology of the word intelligence, intelligere, to choose among. The ability to select the good grain. For the Egyptians, this embodied the idea of wisdom very well. Now, the Greek was a man deeply inclined toward anthropomorphism, a deep admiration for the human form. They were highly focused on aesthetics. They did not perceive wisdom through an ibis. That held no meaning for them. So, they took this concept of wisdom and created their own symbol. A beautiful young man Hermes with his staff. Hermes the winged messenger. And later, the Romans did the same. transforming him into a very similar symbol Mercury. Now look, when our civilization wants to express a concept, like wisdom or love, how does it represent it? It has to use symbols from the past. We haven't created our own symbols. Do you see that? We didn't create them. For love, you have to use Venus. You go to a courthouse symbolizing justice, and they place Themis there, holding the scales and blindfolded. Don't you see this everywhere? We have to borrow symbols. Because our civilization, which created atomic accelerators and jet planes, has not created its own symbols. Symbols are meant to express deeply metaphysical concepts. Perhaps we haven't created them as we don't want to express metaphysical concepts. We are a very materialistic era. Is there anything wrong with us working with borrowed symbols? Why didn't the Greeks take the ibis and create their own symbol? Because each civilization has its own psychic structure. And with more appropriate symbols, you can convey the concept much more effectively. Let's say you ask me, what is justice? I show you an image of Themis, dressed in Greek attire. Do you know what your mind is going to say? In ancient Greece, it was easy to be just. I'd like to see her living in today's world. I'd like to see Plato doing the things he talks about. Stuck in traffic on the Brighetto Bridge. Do you see what I mean? We create escape routes. Why? Because you've placed a figure dressed in something too far removed in time and space. You would have to clothe wisdom in the 21st century to show that it can exist here and now. That would leave you with no escape routes. It would be easier to understand this concept. It would be key for formation of human being, but our society works with borrowed symbols. Because perhaps this bridge to the metaphysical is no longer what matters most today. When you educate a young person, you inform them, but you don't form them. Hence why we don't have our own symbols. I see a clear example. I believe if I were to speak with Plato and he asked, his 21st century life, it has no symbols of its own, no need to explain, I get it. Because the one who doesn't build a bridge is the one who doesn't want to reach the other side. It's obvious. Why would he build a bridge if I don't want to go there? This is a symptom of a very materialistic society, very shallow broad, but very shallow. This is the cycle we are living in. Continuing and going a bit further, historical references. Don't worry, I'm not going to read all of this to you, not at all. But just so you can get a sense of how everyone used to speak about him. Lactantius spoke of Hermes Trismegistus. Clement of Alexandria also spoke highly of him in general. It was St. Augustine who came along and he didn't like Hermes Trismegistus. And the reason is somewhat curious, even picturesque. St. Augustine said the following, that there was a great deal of knowledge within the Hermetic works that had been revealed through Christianity, and that if this had been said beforehand, it must have been the devil who whispered it into that man's ear, to discredit Christianity that was yet to come. It may sound amusing, but he truly associated Hermes Trismegistus with a demonic being, and it impacted people. It gave rise to wave of bias. Yet even so, within the church, there was still a Roger Bacon, who was a minister of the church, a Saint Albertus Magnus, who became a saint, who read the Corpus Hermeticum. In short, many people took an interest in his work throughout history. Now, during the Renaissance, things became truly powerful. The Renaissance is a remarkable era to explore. Iona. When we think of the Renaissance, we usually think only of painting, of sculpture, which is already amazing. But what happened in philosophy during the Renaissance is something truly extraordinary. It is this philosophy that lies behind Leonardo's paintings and Michelangelo's sculptures, a fantastic humanistic conception of the universe. We had a historical turning point that was very significant. It was the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks. Byzantine knowledge, especially in philosophy, was far more advanced than that of Europe. There were many philosophers there. Then came Islam, which at that time was not a religion particularly favorable to philosophy in that context. There were some periods when it was, but at that specific moment it was not. What happened? All those thinkers found themselves expelled, and they went to Italy. They arrived in Florence, one after another. There was one figure in particular, named George Gemistus Plethon, who had a profound influence on Cosimo de' Medici. Cosimo de' Medici founded a Platonic academy in his own home. The Academy of Plato was reborn. right in the heart of Florence. It became known as the Florentine Academy of Corelli. They celebrated Plato's birthday every year. They studied the Republic. They studied Plato's works in their entirety. And within this context, something emerged in the hands of Cosimo de' Medici. The Corpus Hermeticum. A portion of the treatises of the Corpus Hermeticum emerged. It was believed there were 15, but today we know there are more. 14 of those treatises. And he gave them to a brilliant young man, his protege named Marsilio Ficino. Marsilio Ficino translated them in 1463. This was 15c. Quattrocento. He translated the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin for the first time. You have no idea who this influenced. It influenced two entities, God and everyone else. This was a revolution in the intellectual thought of the Renaissance. Artists were impacted, because that group who attended the Caird School was truly formidable. You had everyone from Sandro Botticelli to Raphael Sanzio. Leonardo da Vinci was more connected to Milan, to the court there. But even he ended up passing through that circle. Everyone was influenced by the school. The great names we know today, they were all influenced by that school. Pico della Mirandola, for example, he was a genius. That place became a center for the dissemination of ancient thought. They also translated Zoroaster. With content that was more deistic, they brought in a wealth of Platonic knowledge. This had a profound influence, but interestingly, long before that, Hermetic knowledge remained alive throughout the Middle Ages, through the medieval alchemists. So, if you take a good ancient alchemy treatise, and I only recommend working with ancient sources, because today there is a great deal of fantasy surrounding it, you'll see that the alchemists were Hermeticists. Within their test tubes, where they supposedly aimed to turn lead into gold, what they were truly trying to transform was the man of lead into a man of gold, the ignorant into the wise. What they sought was to make Hermetic knowledge a lived experience. Now that whole thing about, have you ever seen how an alchemist lived? They were men who lived a priestly, very simple life. Why would those men want to produce gold? What a wild ambition. That was just a facade to protect themselves from the Inquisition. Because being ambitious and wanting gold wouldn't get you in trouble, inquisitors. It wasn't a big problem, everyone was like that. But if you were a philosopher and wanted to elevate humanity, you were in serious trouble with the Inquisition. So it was a facade of chemists, when in truth they were Hermeticists. This knowledge, it's interesting you'll see that the Emerald Tablet, the Corpus Hermeticum. Today, if you ask a philosopher, they'll tell you. It was written at the beginning of the Christian era and began to circulate during the Middle Ages. It circulated widely during the Middle Ages, still in its Coptic version. How? Wasn't it from the time of Hermes Trismegistus? How could it have been written then? Never confuse the historical date of a work with the day it was written. Because for those great civilizations, writing was already a sign of decline. Because writing exposes a work to being profaned, to being read by just anyone. You know, the Rig Veda from the Hindu tradition was written 6 centuries before Christ. It was the duty of the Brahmins to memorize the Rig Veda. They weren't allowed to write it down. That profaned the work. Writing makes a work vulnerable to falling into anyone's hands. So, when a sacred book is written, it's a sign that there is already such a great level of decline. People fear losing everything, so they choose not to take the risk. They choose to condense it. They choose to risk it being profaned. You're going to say that the Rig Veda was born in the 6th century before Christ? That's ridiculous. Everyone knows it's old. But it was written down only then. Hermes Trismegistus, or the Corpus Hermeticum, where Hermes also appeared in written form at that time. Until then, no one knew of it in writing. It was a tradition passed down orally. This is not uncommon in many traditions. Sacred books are not written down. It's too risky. They memorize the sacred books and pass them on from mouth to ear, which is precisely the essence of Hermetic knowledge. As I mentioned to you, that Curiosity Nag Hammadi was in 1945. Do you know the story? The shepherds were tending their sheep. They threw a stone, who knows why. They heard a sound coming from clay breaking, clay jars. filled with scrolls upon scrolls. That's how Nag Hammadi was discovered. As well as Qumran, the Qumran scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls. By chance, Nag Hammadi was even more curious because they took several of those jars home with scrolls inside, and their mother used them to light the fire. Several of them, until someone showed up there, some historian lost in that region, because Nag Hammadi is closer to Cairo, 100 km away. It's a tiny little town. He said, "No, give that to me. This thing has value." No one knows how much was lost. Among these manuscripts are original fragments of the Asclepius. That is, part of the Corpus Hermeticum. You know, for example, Nag Hammadi is related to Gnostic Christianity, whereas the Qumran Hills, which are the Dead Sea Scrolls, are from the Jewish Essenes. You know that among the Dead Sea Scrolls they found, alongside various passages from the Old Testament, they found Plato's Republic, a large excerpt among the Essenes of the Dead Sea. Isn't that fascinating? Read philosophy, they read Plato. Plato's Republic, there's a large passage there. Just so we understand that these people had a very profound dedication to philosophy, a universalist perspective. Well, this is very important for us to understand Hermes Trismegistus, because he is essentially a thrice great initiate. What does it mean to start? This here is an image from a wonderful book. By the way, I've given lectures on this topic. They're available on YouTube under the title Medieval Alchemy. And I relied heavily on this book, which is called the Mutus Liber, the silent book of medieval alchemy. This is an alchemical image. This is Jacob's ladder. This image is very useful for us to understand the concept of initiation. For an Egyptian and for classical peoples in general, human beings came into the world for one purpose only, no two aims. It is to move from ignorance to wisdom. There aren't two reasons for a person to be in the world. There is one, to rise ignorance and reach wisdom, because wisdom is the full expression of the human condition. Now, they say, not everyone can climb together at the same time. Do you know why? Because people lose their sense of direction. They need 2 or 3 heroes to go ahead and lead the way. Who reaches the second or third step and says, "Hey everyone, climb up, this is the way." Because human beings need external images to find inspiration. Epictetus, a Roman philosopher, used to say, "Seeds of greatness in a person need images to grow and flourish." If I say to you, shall we be wise? I like it, but what does a wise person look like? Show me one. I need to have that. I need to pick up the Analects of Confucius and say, this is it. There has to be an image. How can you walk towards something you can't see? They say it's essential for the evolution of humanity that a handful of people, not many, just a few, go ahead and show, look, this is what it means to be human. It's good. Come, it's possible. So, initiations were like monasteries. Initiation is different from philosophy. Philosophy is a search for wisdom, but by beings who still have a long way to go. Initiation involves beings of a much higher level. It is a monastic system where masters and disciples seek to live a process of life in which they accelerate their own growth in order to help illuminate the path for those who come after. Imagine that you're going to live for 60 years, and you'll learn half a dozen things about living together. I'm being optimistic here, because people living 60 years don't learn anything about coexistence. But let's say that a 60-year-old person had learned half a dozen things about how to live with others. Now imagine that within a system in an Egyptian school, with a master in whom you had deep trust, he would create experiences in your life so that you could learn those half a dozen things in just 1 year. If you could endure it, you'd come out the other side with a lifetime experience in a single year. It's just an example. They greatly accelerated the growth of the human being through a system of trust between master and disciple. Then these men, deeply mature and well prepared to face life, were spread in Egypt and served as role models. So Egypt had initiated sages. Some people looked at these sages and said, "Wow, what a marvelous Tina sage. I love this, I want to be like that." Who loves wisdom? Philosophers, a group of people striving to mirror that example. And society looked at these philosophers and said, "Look how wonderful. I want to be like that too. I want to be a seeker of wisdom." In other words, the entire society was uplifted by the presence of a sage. And then they would say, this is culture. Cult cultivates what is best in the human being. It elevates the human being, just between us. Only among those of us in this room and the listeners who will watch this lecture. If we, nowadays, were to go through a process of strictly following everything that our 21st century culture tells us to do, all the trends that culture circulates, would we become better human beings? I find that very doubtful. I think it's quite unlikely. Imagine if you followed all the trends of the day. Do you think you would become a better person? Highly unlikely. Do you know what that means? Our culture is not cultivating the human being. It's a counterculture. It pulls us downward. It dehumanizes, makes things superficial, trivializes. He says that in a culture where the presence of the wise exists, if you follow what that culture advocates, you grow. It is a culture that lifts you upward. From the moment the possibility of wisdom no longer exists, what kind of values will the culture uphold? Where do the values of a society without wisdom come from? From the collective unconscious, from people's unconscious desires, passions, and instincts. Because if it doesn't come from above, it comes from below. Culture ends up glorifying the instincts, selfishness, personal interests. It becomes a counterculture. So it is said that society is like a pyramid. There's a top to the pyramid. There are a few wise people. Everyone looks upward and sees that as a possibility. Creates an ascending movement ion as the predominant cultural element. An invitation to become increasingly human. These initiation schools were not just an option for individual growth for very special men. They were a social necessity within Egypt. Society was structured around this central point, which was wisdom. And it had and always had until a certain moment when the decline of Egypt began. Then in the past period, we see that this no longer existed. If you read a modern historian and novelist, Christian Jack, he talks about the fall of the last initiatic school of Egypt. Already in the Roman era, all the decline that unfolded generation after generation. He writes about it in a very beautiful way. He is the author of that great series, Ramses. In any case, the fact is that Egypt was like that. Hermes Trismegistus was an initiated master who had his disciples and passed on his knowledge within a monastic system. It is said that this knowledge was shared with sages from various civilizations, who came from all corners of the world. A sage, he'll go. You know that in Greece, it was fashionable to go to Egypt. Later in Rome, it became fashionable to go to Greece. That idea remained that Egypt was magnificent. People look back in an effort to recover that knowledge. So, the fundamental phrase, the basic sayings of Hermeticism, which are well known, I've shared with you. First of them says, the lips of wisdom are closed, except to the ears of understanding. What does that mean? A master who holds knowledge only passes on that knowledge to a disciple with a strong moral foundation, with a well-developed character. That is, from mouth to ear. When you buy that Tupperware container, you might say, she's lost it. What does Tupperware and Hermeticism? You'll see it written there, hermetically sealed. Do you know where that expression in our language comes from? From hermetically sealed? From Hermeticism. The schools were so closed off, they kept such strict secrecy regarding their knowledge, that it gave rise to this expression, which echoed even into the Neo-Latin languages. Meaning, even Tupperware is inspired by Hermes Trismegistus. That's how they were. Knowledge was not shared publicly. Later, Plato would write a phrase, which I find very interesting, and I'll even include it on the next slide, which says, absolute ignorance is preferable to knowledge in the wrong hands. See if you can grasp what this really means. Let's try to approach it with statistical reasoning. Imagine the mastery of atomic energy, nuclear fission, the kind we've been using for quite some time. Since the work of Oppenheimer and so on. If you think about it, we have some nuclear power plants around the world that generate energy. But do you think that if we were to do the math, between the harm this knowledge has caused and the benefit this knowledge has brought. Which one do you think would outweigh the other at this point in history? Consider Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Look, if we didn't have nuclear power plants, we could have built hydroelectric plants and lived fine. But the damage we've already done with this, the risks we face with the madmen out there, who are constantly chasing nuclear energy. Do you realize that perhaps from the standpoint of our moral development, given the widespread immaturity of humanity today, it might have been better if we didn't have this toy? It's like a baby holding, and if there's a real risk of getting hurt. Do you see? That's what Plato says. Absolute ignorance is preferable to knowledge in the wrong hands. These inner schools had criteria for admission, a kind of entrance exam, but an exam that evaluated a person's morality, their self-mastery, their value is not so much the breadth of their knowledge. Because he says, breadth, that's acquired quickly. If you lack some knowledge, I can teach you. You'll learn quickly. Now, if you lack character, there's no way to teach you that quickly. That's a process of building that can often take a very long time. So, they measured the depth verticality rather than the breadth of knowledge. They focused on formation, not just information. This other phrase, which is also hermetic, was used when people would ask, "Why don't you share your knowledge with society?" They would say, "We must give milk to children and meat to grown men." Society is like children, milk is appropriate. A man, when mature, can consume the essence of knowledge, which is the meat, because then he won't use it to harm himself or humanity. He's no longer a baby knife in hand. He is a man who knows how to handle a knife. He won't be a psychopath committing a crime. He'll be someone chopping vegetables. He knows the proper use for each thing. He understands things are not good or bad in themselves. Good or bad depends on something's use. Ultimately, Hermeticism was characterized by highly reserved knowledge. This is the quote from Plato I mentioned to you. Absolute ignorance is preferable to knowledge in the wrong hands. Its hallmark was knowledge passed from master to disciple. Egypt as the homeland of mysteries is a fascinating concept. As I mentioned to you, in the Middle Ages, most people were illiterate. Knowledge was extremely scarce. But when a strange person was seen wandering around the feudal lands, people say he came from Egypt. Do you know why? Because it became imprinted in the collective unconscious that Egypt is synonymous with wisdom, with mysteries, with something that inspires awe. Even if people no longer knew anything concrete, the idea remained that something special had happened in Egypt. Something happened there. Even today, when someone wants to open a somewhat esoteric shop, they want to show you something a bit mysterious. They hang up all sorts of little Egyptian trinkets, even if those things don't always match what's actually being offered. But still, if they want to suggest mystery, they use Egypt. So Egypt is deeply associated in the unconscious memory of humanity with profound knowledge. That's quite interesting. This association was never lost during the Middle Ages. Dissemination throughout the ancient world and the master key of religions. This book refers to the master key of the Semitic monotheistic religions, as well as Babylonian and Persian religions. It had a strong influence on India and also on the Greek world and the Mediterranean world as a whole, both Scandinavian and Celtic religions. In other words, the foundation of religions that not only existed in the past, but of the traditional religions still present. There is a great deal of Hermetic knowledge embedded behind them, perhaps misunderstood, perhaps not fully brought into awareness, but it is there, undeniably. It states something very interesting, that the Hermetic school, Hermes Trismegistus, and the Egyptian masters as a whole were deeply concerned that the knowledge they possessed, the secret doctrine they held, would not be turned into theology. It won't become crystallized into a creed. They say, when this knowledge turns into a creed, the vision of the universe, the laws, become dogmas. Instead of admiring those who understand these laws, people begin to worship them. This causes the essence to be lost very quickly. The book mentions, for example, when it passed through Persia, that Egyptian knowledge was transformed into religion, into Zoroastrianism, into the religion of Ahura Mazda. This quickly turned into dogma. became anthropomorphized, turning into a cult, centered on personality of certain figures. He says this causes it to lose its capacity for reflection and learning through the knowledge that philosophy once preserved. He says the same thing happened in India when the Brahmins adopted a more theological than philosophical approach. There was a significant decline in Brahmanism. Thus Brahmanism itself had to reassess, leading to the creation of the 6 schools of philosophy called the 6 darshanas, because it declined to such an extent that no one really knew what they were doing. You know this is history. That's when like Shankaracharya's Vedanta was born, which was a school of philosophy, because when knowledge becomes crystallized into dogma and begins to generate anthropomorphic figures and very superficial forms of worship, it becomes difficult, and the deep understanding of the mysteries is lost. Symbols are mistaken for reality. And he says, religions are necessary, but we must be careful not to lose the philosophy behind them. And only theology remains, because soon no one will even know what it truly means anymore. If you take a dogmatic religion, take any given symbol, and try to reason with that priesthood, they'll say this isn't historical, a symbol. And generally you won't know how to interpret it. The philosophical side is seen as something negative. They say, be careful not to lose the secret doctrine, so that knowledge is not lost, entirely transformed into religious dogma. Religions are necessary, but philosophy must not cease to exist. It has been preserved by a few throughout the ages, which is something we've discussed. Who knows who passed on this knowledge all the way to our time? It's always been a minority. But he says, whenever humanity is in need, this knowledge will re-emerge. Whenever the disciple is ready, a master will appear. Humanity needed it during the Middle Ages, and it blossomed through alchemy. At any moment, when there are people capable of understanding this knowledge, it will return. It was never lost. It remains hidden within the unconscious of humanity. If you are ready and in need of it, it resurfaces. The Hermetic alchemy I was telling you about had nothing to do with the transformation of metals, with human transformation, and it was an example of the blossoming of this knowledge. And it is said that in some way we are living in a time that is as dark as the Middle Ages, but with a different kind of obscurantism. It is not a religious obscurantism, it is a materialistic obscurantism, rooted in selfishness and superficiality. Perhaps this knowledge is also at a good moment to resurface. For those who are capable of understanding it, in a critical time, I brought this alchemist's retort, which is an image from the Mutus Liber, so you can see who is inside it, which is the symbol of sulfur. It is the king, it is a man. There is no metal, no chemical substance inside. It is a king with scepter and crown. That was what they aimed to produce as the final result of their work. A man who ruled over himself, with power over himself, with self-mastery, with wisdom. That was the product of alchemy. Not about making gold, it was about producing men of gold. And finally, in our brief talk today, this is a quote from the Kybalion. Wherever the footprints of the masters are found, the ears of the prepared disciples will open wide. It is another version of the same idea. Whenever the disciple is ready, a master will appear. If you need something in order to grow as a human being, if you need some knowledge to become a point of reference, not for selfish reasons, but to be a reference so that others may grow through you, in some way, that knowledge will come into your life. In some way. This is beautifully portrayed in fairy tales, which I also enjoy much. The prince says, I will save the princess. The prince is just a young lad. Sometimes he doesn't even have a beard yet. And the princess is with the dragon. But he says, I will, and he commits himself to an altruistic cause. He's not doing it for himself. He's doing it because he believes the cause is just. You can see that he leaves the kingdom with no chance, with no possibility, ready to become dragon barbecue. But along the way, his latent powers begin to emerge. He starts to become equipped. An old man appears, to whom he offers water. This old man reveals something to him, gives him a cloak that makes him invisible. A secret is revealed. A little bird appears and tells him something. Hidden powers begin to emerge. They start surfacing along the journey. The knowledge he needs begins to appear. And when he faces the dragon, he is armed to the teeth and fully capable of winning. But why? Because he is committed to something elevated, noble, and selfless. He is not driven by selfish interests, and that allows knowledge to blossom in his life. Whenever the disciple is ready, a master appears. It is said in times of historical decline, this knowledge once of Egypt was never Egypt's. It belongs to humanity. When humanity needs it, it resurfaces. Formative, vertical knowledge, so that human beings may better understand the laws of life and learn to interact positively with that life, with that nature, in the sense of building oneself and helping to build the humanity to which one belongs. That is our purpose on earth. So we'll see that this was our introduction for today. Introduction in Theme 1. Next week, we'll cover Chapter 2 of the book, which offers an overview of the 7 principles. It will go through all 7, quite briefly, then Chapters 3, 4, and 5. It will go through each one individually and explore them in depth. Naturally, since our intention is to form a reading group, it would be very beneficial if there were actual reading involved. In other words, that you read the material, because a reading group becomes much more enriching when it is interactive. When you participate, when you bring your questions, the goal is truly to create a reading group, and the chapters are short, so there's really no room for that mental excuse of I didn't have time. It's totally manageable to read between one meeting and the next. I'm sure if you read it, it will become much more engaging for everyone, and it's a great book to have. I assure you, you won't regret having a book like this on your nightstand. All right, so for those who wish to continue participating with us, make an effort to read Chapter 2. You're going to enjoy it.